The death penalty has claimed countless lives throughout history, but none quite as controversial as the execution of Byron Black on August 5, 2025. A man who'd spent 35 years on death row awaiting the ultimate punishment. But was this execution the final chapter of a story long overdue, or was it a tragic mistake? Was justice truly served, or had the system failed him, as it has failed many before him? Imagine this, a man who has lost his mental faculties over decades, yet he is still sentenced to die. Was it right to execute him, or should we have questioned whether he was ever fit for such a punishment? Stick with me as we uncover the shocking details of a case that will have you questioning the true meaning of justice. Byron Black had been convicted for the 1988 triple murder of his girlfriend 𝗟𝗪𝗔𝗖𝗞 Clay, and her two daughters, Latoya and Lakeisha. His crime was horrific, a brutal killing that sent shockwaves through Tennessee. But what makes Byron's story so haunting, is not just the crime he committed, it's what followed. The moral and ethical questions that surfaced in the years leading up to his execution. Byron Black wasn't just any criminal. He was a man whose mental state had deteriorated to a point where the question became, did he even understand the consequences of his actions? Did he deserve to die after living a life of violence, pain, and mental suffering? This wasn't a case of a man facing justice with a clear mind. No, Byron was a broken man, mentally and physically, and the system was about to decide his fate in the most final way imaginable. Let's go back to the beginning, to that fateful night in 1988. March 25th to be precise, a night that would set in motion events that would lead to 3 murders and the eventual execution of a man who had already spent decades locked in prison. Byron Black, at the time 32 years old, was granted a furlough from prison. He was allowed to leave the workhouse for the weekend. A simple break from his sentence. But what seemed like a temporary reprieve for a man in a broken system turned into a deadly act of violence. It was just another Friday for 𝗟𝗪𝗔𝗖𝗞 Clay, a dedicated nurse who had just finished her shift at the hospital. Her sister, Lynette Bell, picked her up, and together, they drove to Amelia Bell's house, where 𝗟𝗪𝗔 and her 2 daughters, Latoya, 9, and Lakeisha, 6, would spend the night. But there was someone else in the car, Byron Black. He had been in and out of 𝗟𝗪𝗔's life for years, but tonight was different. Byron wasn't just the quiet, distant figure in the back seat, he was a man on a mission. After dropping 𝗟𝗪𝗔 and the girls off, everything seemed fine. 𝗟𝗪𝗔 stayed longer than expected, chatting with her family, borrowing an iron from her mother, promising to return it the next day. A simple exchange, nothing out of the ordinary. But nothing was ordinary about what would happen next. As the night fell and the family went to bed, Byron Black entered 𝗟𝗪𝗔's apartment. It was dark, and everyone was asleep. In one brutal act, he took 𝗟𝗪𝗔's life. A single shot to her head. She never woke up. She never saw it coming. Byron didn't hesitate. He moved on to his next victim, Latoya, 𝗟𝗪𝗔's 9-year-old daughter. The shot had startled her, but it was too late. The gun was raised again, and Latoya fell to the ground, her tiny body wedged between the bed and the dresser. Her death wasn't immediate. The autopsy would later confirm that Latoya's body twitched for up to 10 minutes after the bullet struck her. She was still alive, trapped in the agony of her final moments. Byron could have stopped there, but he didn't. He wasn't finished. He walked to Lakeisha's room. The sound of the gunshots must have scared her. She got up. But this wasn't a man who was going to comfort her or protect her. He was the one who would end her life. 2 more shots. The first to her chest, the second near her hip. Lakeisha didn't die instantly. She dragged herself from her bed to the floor, leaving blood stains as she tried to escape. She died face down, just feet from her bed, her blood pooling around her small body. But Byron didn't stop to check if they were alive or dead. He didn't call anyone for help. He locked the door and walked out, as if nothing had happened. As if their lives meant nothing. But here's where the story gets even more chilling. Angela's family started to worry when she didn't return the iron the next day. It wasn't like her. She had promised to return it, but the phone calls went unanswered. Something felt wrong. Angela's mother, Amelia, knew it. She sent a relative to check on her daughter, but still, there was no response. That night, Amelia and Lynette went to the apartment themselves. They knocked on the door. No answer. The apartment was eerily silent, the shades drawn tight. Angela's car was parked outside. Everything seemed normal, except for the absence of life inside. They forced the door open, and what they found made their stomachs turn. Angela, Latoya, and Lakeisha were dead, all three of them, lying in pools of their own blood. A family torn apart in a single night. But this wasn't the end of the story. The investigation revealed more than just a tragic crime. There was something else, something that no one could have predicted. As police combed through the scene, they found Byron Black's fingerprints on the phones in the apartment. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But what happened next, in the courtroom, raised even more questions about Byron's mental state, and whether he even knew what he had done. Could he have understood his actions, or was he just a victim of a system that failed to care about his condition until it was too late? The twist here is this: Byron Black's execution wasn't just about punishing him for the murders, it was about facing a system that had left him to deteriorate for decades. As the case unfolded, a much darker question emerged: who was truly to blame here? As his execution day approached, there were calls for his mental health to be taken into account. Could Byron even comprehend the consequences of his actions? Was this really justice, or was it a brutal punishment of a broken man? But in the final hours before his execution, something happened that would force everyone to rethink the very nature of justice. What happened to Byron Black during those final moments would leave the world wondering whether execution was truly the answer. Stay with me, because what happens next will shock you. What do you think? Was justice served, or was Byron Black another victim of a broken system? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this one that challenge everything we know about justice. After Byron Black's crime was discovered, the investigation quickly turned into a search for answers. His fingerprints were found at the crime scene, a clear sign that he had been there. But the case wasn't just about finding a murderer, it was about uncovering the truth behind a broken system that had allowed a man like Byron to fall through the cracks for decades. Was this execution truly a form of justice? Or had the system failed him, as it had failed so many others? Byron had been arrested for the triple murder, but there was one thing that made his case different from others: his mental health. Byron wasn't the typical criminal. He wasn't the cold, calculated murderer that we often hear about in these cases. His mental state had deteriorated over the years, leaving experts, his family, and the public divided about whether he even understood his actions at the time of the murders. Could someone in his condition really be held fully accountable for such violence? Let's take a deeper look at the man behind the crimes, the man whose execution would spark so much controversy. Byron Black wasn't just someone with a violent past, he was someone with a history of mental illness. His childhood had been marked by exposure to lead poisoning, which caused severe developmental issues. He never learned to read, struggled with simple tasks like basic math, and even as an adult he lived with his parents, unable to live independently. Could a man like this truly be held to the same standards as others? As Byron sat in jail awaiting trial, his defense team made a bold claim: Byron was intellectually disabled and unable to understand the consequences of his actions. Their argument wasn't that he didn't commit the murders, but rather that his mental health made him unfit for a death sentence. In fact, They argued that Byron was so far from understanding the full weight of his crime that executing him would be a violation of his human rights. But what made things even more complicated was that Byron had been through the system before. In 1986, just 2 years before the murders, he had shot Benny Clay, Angela's ex-husband, in a violent outburst. Benny survived, but that incident was enough to raise even more questions about Byron's mental state. Could his actions have been driven by something deeper than just anger or jealousy? And yet, despite these mental health concerns, the state of Tennessee proceeded with the trial and sentencing as though nothing had changed. Byron Black was convicted of 3 counts of murder, and the jury's recommendation was unanimous: death. His execution was set. But was it right? Could someone like Byron, whose mental state had been so seriously impaired, really deserve to be executed for his crimes? The days leading up to his execution were filled with tense legal battles, with Byron's attorneys arguing that he was not fit for execution. They raised the issue of his deteriorating mental health once again, claiming that executing someone in his state was tantamount to torture. But the courts rejected these claims, and Byron's fate was sealed. But what happened next would leave the world reeling. What did Byron do in those final days? Was he prepared for what was about to happen? Did he truly understand that his life was about to end, or was he trapped in a world that no longer made sense to him? As the date for Byron Black's execution drew nearer, the tension surrounding his case grew unbearable. Supporters of the death penalty rallied behind the decision, arguing that Byron's crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. On the other hand, those who questioned the fairness of the justice system began speaking out. The arguments shifted away from the crime itself, and focused more on Byron's mental health, his years on death row, and the degradation of his mind as he aged. Despite the mounting questions about his mental state, the legal process continued. The state of Tennessee seemed determined to press forward with the execution, refusing to acknowledge the critical impact of his deteriorating condition. For 35 years, Byron had been locked away, trapped in a cycle of violence, mental decline, and legal battles. Each time his defense raised concerns about his intellectual disabilities, the courts rejected the plea for mercy. Byron's defense team wasn't just asking for a delay, they were calling for an honest examination of whether executing a man in his condition could truly be just. They raised the question, was it right to punish someone who, at this point in his life, could barely understand the consequences of his actions? But in the end, the courts didn't stop. Byron Black was sentenced to death, despite growing concerns that his punishment was more about expedience than justice. This wasn't just another case of someone facing the death penalty, it was the story of a broken system, a system that had allowed a man, whose mental faculties were clearly failing, to be condemned to die. It was a moral quandary. Can you execute a person who has deteriorated mentally over decades? Can you apply the death penalty when there's a question of whether the person even understands why they're being put to death? These questions weren't just academic anymore. They were real, and they were urgent. Byron's case was different. He wasn't just facing the consequences of his actions in the 1980s. He was confronting the decay of his mind as he grew older. The question now was this: was he fit to be executed? Should a man who had spent years in a deteriorating state be held fully accountable for a crime committed so long ago? Then came the unexpected. The final days leading up to Byron's execution were marked by legal wrangling and appeals. His attorneys continued to argue that Byron's mental state made him unfit for execution, but the courts were unwavering. Still, there was one final twist that no one had anticipated. In the final hours before his death, the physical reality of Byron's health would take center stage in a way no one had predicted. As the lethal injection was prepared, the very defibrillator implanted in his chest to regulate his failing heart would become the focus of a moral dilemma that no one had foreseen. Would the device interfere with the execution? Would the shocks from the defibrillator cause unnecessary pain, creating a torturous final experience for a man who had already been left broken by the system? The question became, was the justice system prepared to handle this new complexity, or were they about to make a mistake that no one would be able to reverse? The clock was ticking down, and all eyes were on Byron Black, who had already spent decades locked away. Was this really the end of the story, or was this just another chapter in the moral and ethical maze that the system had created? Byron Black was about to become the symbol of something much bigger than just the death penalty. What happened in Byron's final moments would shock even the staunchest supporters of the death penalty. But before we dive into that, think for a moment, how many people in the system had failed him? And how many others like Byron had been caught in the crossfire of a broken system that failed to see humanity in its punishment? Stay with me, because the truth of what happened next may change everything you thought you knew about justice. What do you think? Was Byron's execution justified, or was it a reflection of a system that never took his mental health seriously? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. This conversation is just getting started. And don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned for more. You won't want to miss the next part of Byron Black's story. It will make you question everything about the system we trust to deliver justice. On the morning of August 5, 2025, the clock ticked down to Byron Black's final moments. The world had already debated whether he should be executed, but now it was time for the state of Tennessee to take action. Byron's case had sparked countless discussions about the death penalty, mental health, and whether the justice system had failed him. But as the day approached, all those moral questions seemed to fade into the background. What mattered now was that Byron Black, the man who had spent 35 years behind bars, whose mental state had deteriorated beyond recognition, was about to die. But his final moments would be far more complicated than anyone expected. It wasn't just about the legal decision to end his life, it was about how he would be executed. Byron's execution would take place by lethal injection, but there was something different about his case. Byron had an implantable defibrillator, a device meant to regulate his failing heart. The problem was that this device could potentially cause unimaginable pain during the execution process. If the defibrillator misinterpreted the effects of the lethal drugs, it might deliver shocks to Byron's heart, causing intense pain during the process. This posed a serious problem. Was it ethical to execute someone with such a device in place? The very thing meant to keep him alive could cause him torture in his final moments. The issue became a point of contention in the final hours leading up to the execution, with Byron's lawyers arguing that the defibrillator should be deactivated before the injection. But the state of Tennessee had already made its decision. The Supreme Court ruled that the execution would proceed as scheduled, with the defibrillator left in place. The argument was that the shocks would not be significant enough to cause any harm. They were wrong. Byron was led into the execution chamber at 10:31 a.m., his frail, elderly body strapped to the gurney. Witnesses later reported that his hands were covered by a sheet, a part of standard protocol, but it seemed unusually high, concealing more than just his body. At 69, Byron looked nothing like the man who had committed the murders decades ago. His face showed signs of dementia, and his mental clarity had been questioned by everyone involved in the case. What would happen next was a surreal sequence of events that no one had expected. As the lethal injection began, Byron's body jerked and spasmed. At first, witnesses thought it was just the usual side effects of the drugs, but it became clear that something was wrong. His chest heaved, his breath coming in heavy gasps, as if his body was struggling against the chemicals. He couldn't seem to breathe properly, and he appeared to be in pain. And then, something terrifying happened. Byron Black, a man who had lived through decades of suffering, looked up and said the words that would haunt the witnesses for years. He groaned, "I can't do this. This is hurting so bad." Imagine this, a man who had already been through so much, his body failing him, his mind no longer capable of fully understanding his actions, now experiencing excruciating pain in his final moments. Was this justice? Or was this torture? The defibrillator was likely causing electric shocks to his heart, attempting to restore a rhythm that was already fading, but with no success. His spiritual advisor, who had been standing by his side, leaned in close, offering quiet words of comfort. She whispered softly, "I'm so sorry." But the pain was undeniable. Byron continued to breathe heavily, his groaning growing louder. This was no longer just a legal execution, it had become a brutal spectacle. And then, at 10:36 a.m., Byron Black's hand was raised once more, a final gesture of distress, an attempt to move, or perhaps a silent cry for help. Then, he went still. Byron Black was pronounced dead at 10:43 a.m., after a mandatory 5-minute waiting period. But the true question remained, was this justice? Or was this a mistake? What happened during Byron Black's execution sent shockwaves through the nation, raising questions about the ethics of the death penalty, the moral costs of capital punishment, and the humanity we often overlook when a person is condemned to die. In his final moments, Byron wasn't just a man facing death. He was a man who had been failed by the system, and his last breath left us with more unanswered questions than before. Should someone with Byron's mental and physical condition have faced the death penalty? Were the concerns about his health dismissed in favor of expediency? The justice system has already made its decision, but what if the real crime was in executing a man who could barely understand his fate? Is it ever okay to execute someone who is mentally ill or has a condition that could cause them excruciating pain in their final moments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did Byron's execution leave us with justice, or did it show us the cracks in our justice system? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that explore the deeper questions surrounding justice, punishment, and human rights. Byron Black's execution on August 5, 2025, left more questions than answers. His final moments, marked by confusion, pain, and uncertainty, had already sparked public debate. Was this truly the way justice should be carried out? As the world watched, Byron Black's death wasn't the end of his story, it became a symbol of a broken system. His case wasn't just about a man who murdered his girlfriend and 2 children in a brutal act of violence. It was about the flaws in the justice system, the moral dilemmas it raised, and the human cost of executing a person who had been severely damaged by mental illness. Byron Black had been locked away for years, his mind deteriorating as he aged, and his execution brought those deep flaws to the forefront. The questions surrounding Byron's execution were far-reaching. His mental state, the defibrillator shocks during his execution, and the moral dilemmas about whether someone like him could truly understand the consequences of his actions, all of these played a part in the conversations that followed. Was Byron Black's execution really the justice the system claimed it to be? Or was this a case of the system's failure to adequately address mental health issues and to see the humanity in those it sentenced? In the wake of his death, those questions lingered in the air like a cloud of uncertainty. Advocates against the death penalty saw this case as further proof that the system was fundamentally flawed, especially when it came to those who were mentally ill or disabled. For others, Byron's crimes and the pain he caused his victims' families meant that his death was justified. But what do we do when the line between justice and human rights becomes blurred? As the years pass, Byron Black's execution will continue to be a point of reflection, not just for the justice system, but for society as a whole. The more we learn about mental health and the death penalty, the more we realize that this isn't just about the crime itself. It's about the system we've created and the human beings caught in its gears. How many more Byron Blacks are out there? How many more people are condemned to death without ever having their mental condition truly considered? These questions are not easily answered, and Byron's story may be one of the many that will haunt the debate for years to come. But here's the most difficult question: did Byron Black's execution truly serve justice, or did it show us the failure of a system that sometimes doesn't care about the people it condemns? His case should make us all reflect on the kind of society we want to live in, where the balance between punishment and human dignity is at stake. Can we afford to keep executing people who are mentally ill or unable to understand their own fate? And if we can't, what does that say about the fairness of the death penalty? As the debates continue to rage on, the story of Byron Black's execution is far from over. His death is just another chapter in a much larger conversation about justice, mental health, and the death penalty itself. What do you think? Should someone with Byron's mental state have been executed? Was it truly justice, or was it something darker, something the system was too quick to overlook? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. This is a conversation that needs to continue. If you've been moved by this story, like, share, and subscribe to get more deep dives into the cases that question everything we know about justice. This case isn't the only one that challenges the idea of capital punishment. Stay tuned for more stories that might just change the way you look at the world.